Right.
That's my.
One of the few times in life I came out on top.
He's gonna be 16.
So that's where I'm going.
Good evening and welcome to the May 3rd, 2016 regular Salem City Council meeting. It will now come to order. We'll have the invocation. Following that, remain standing for the Pledge of Allegiance. Lord, we are meeting today to conduct matters of business, guide our hearts and our minds in the spirit of fairness, right thought and speech, impart your supreme wisdom upon our activities so that our affairs may reach a successful conclusion. Thank you for being our source of guidance today. Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag
Of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And there's one over there, but it's.
You've got two flags. That's
Madam
not
Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Brown?
Here.
Mr. Cushman?
Here.
Mrs. Dickey?
Here.
Mr. Gall?
Here.
Mr. Nestick?
Here.
Mr. Paparotis?
Here.
Mr. Wayhill?
Here.
Seven members.
Thank you. Everyone's received a copy of the minutes of the April 19th, 2016 meeting. Are there any additions, corrections, or deletions to those? Seeing none, they'll stand as approved. We have no petitions and remonstrances this evening. We have no visitors this evening. We'll then move on to the report of city officials. Mayor Berlin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have no report to give tonight, but I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for the mayor? Seeing none. The law director is not here this evening. The auditor advised me prior to the meeting that she had no report, but would answer any questions if any council members had any for her. Dr. Conrad, treasurer.
Report, President, but I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Any questions for Dr. Conrad? Okay. Safety Service Director, Mr. Ketst.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mayor Berlin, and members of council. I really don't want to drag this out. I just said I would update you on a regular basis how we're doing on our K-9 fund. And I don't have an exact amount tonight, but I do know we have enough. We've ordered, as you know, we've ordered the car already. We've sent the check for the dog. Patrolman Garber will be going to school starting June 27th. So hopefully we'll have everything in place by then, but we still need the incidentals that he's gonna need for the dog, but we're moving right along on that. So I just wanted to update.
Any questions for Mr. Ketst?
Just one.
Mr. Brown?
I know in a while back, we appropriated a fund in the budget to have a dog and so forth. But have we ever passed an ordinance say that we are going to accept having a dog in the police department? Is that required? Because he does become part of the police department.
I don't
I don't know.
believe that one's required.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay. Mr. Gall?
Mr. Kentz, how are we doing on the flags over the bridge?
I met with Dr. Trina and Gary Morrison. I told him we were gonna, the street department would hang the flags for them. We're gonna put 8 up. I was able to get the ones like we have downtown for the banners from our electrician, and how they attach, and Hickey Fabricating made those for them. So I gave him a set of those, and Gary took them out to Hickey. That's where they are now. So they just have to be at least 15 feet off the ground to keep away from semi-trailers. And I said, you guys make the decision. The city's not gonna make that decision. I also talked to George Hayes. I told him I would stay in touch with you once I had any information, so.
Do you think we'll have them up by Memorial Day?
It kind of depends on Hickey. I think if Gary or Dr. Trainer would call and bug Leo Hickey, maybe that would help.
Mr. Kentz, on another matter, and I need guidance here, so that's why I'm asking. Following up on former councilwoman Mary Lou Pope's comments about leaves and bags still out on the sidewalks throughout town. I understand the excellent job that your department did in the fall by picking up all those bags that we seem to use and clean up our areas with. Here's my question. I know how busy your street department is with all the potholes and all the work that you're doing on the streets. I know how busy they are with the curbs. I know how busy they are remaking storm sewers catch basins. But it's my understanding that somewhere back at some time, there were some contingency funds given to members of city council. And what I'm asking is, if there were a way in which your employees in the street department, if they're willing to make one more attempt to, and a definite attempt, and so notified attempt to clear the bags that have now deteriorated and the leaves are now coming back out into the streets, et cetera, if that were done after work and they were willing to do an hour or two, whatever it would take, that overtime pay, I would be certainly willing to ask city council to use some of that contingency funds to pay those individuals willing to work one time, one shot, understanding it's not being done every week, but we really need one more roundup. And if that entails, and if they're willing to do that, and if it entails overtime, I would ask if we would use those funds for that purpose. Obviously, we've asked the city and the citizens to clean up their areas for the spring. They've done such. And I'm just wondering if it's a possibility, if you might ask your workers if they're willing to do some overtime work, and at least the third ward funds that I understand I'm allowed to ask for, I would use it for that purpose, because I think it's an absolute benefit to the entire town. And I'm just asking that to be considered.
The only thing I say is, all these fellows, none of them are afraid of work, so I'm sure if we ask them to stay over, they would if we had the funding for it.
Well,
I mean,
I understand
I
from the
don't want-
auditor that there are funds available for contingency purpose, and I can't think of anything more contingent than cleaning up the Salem area.
I can get a ballpark from our street foreman to see how long it would take them to do a complete city sweep one time.
And that's the point, and whatever we can do, and the paper hopefully would make sure everybody understands, we're not doing this Wednesday, then next Wednesday, or the Wednesday after. This is a one-time, one-shot. Let's get rid of the bags that are sitting all over town before they completely deteriorate. Thank you very, very much.
Mr. Nestic.
I just want to remind, and I'll talk to Mr. Gall afterwards, that when we put those council contingency funds together, we had kind of, a method by which we access those funds. And I wrote them down. I gotta find it somewhere, but I'll get that to you also. Towards the end of last year, we put a lot of time into looking at the International Property Maintenance Code. And in that, we had the enforcement was going to be the fire department when they're doing their inspections. Is it possible that we could start getting reports on what the results of their inspections related to the International Property Maintenance Code are, so that we can start tracking what's going on in the downtown and make sure that we're enforcing what we put on the books?
Sure.
Great.
I'll request that from the fire chief.
Thanks.
Mrs. Dickey?
If we would decide to do some kind of cleanup with some contingency funds, last year, I believe it was, we approved temporary workers for the street department. Maybe we could use some of those if we still have them instead of overtime?
They can't drive our trucks.
Okay.
They're not CDL drivers.
Darn.
And also, I think we're planning on using the part-time fellows to work with our new equipment that we just are are being trained on tomorrow, so.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions for Mr. Kents? Seeing none, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Utilities, Mr. Weingart.
Mr. Chairman, members of council, and honorable mayor, I have one ordinance to be presented to commission, or to the committee, or council this evening in reference to the Snyder Road sanitary sewer. The committee met this evening, and I will, unless there's question, we'll let Mr. Gall complete this.
Any questions for Mr. Weingart? Seeing none, thank you. Council Clerk, Mrs. Bricker.
Thank you, I don't have anything.
All right, that concludes the report of city officials. Move on to report of standing committees. Finance, Mr. Cushman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have no committee report this evening.
Streets, alleys, and sidewalks, Mr. Brown.
Thank you. I have no report, but I do have maybe somebody can help me out here. It's regarding my committee and the paving of the streets, but a lady by the name of Georgia Hopkins been trying to reach me, and I checked the phone book and stuff today. Debbie gave me the information, and I can't locate her. If anybody knows of Georgia Hopkins or lives somewhere around South Lincoln Avenue somewhere, please let me know so I can get a hold of this lady. She has a complaint, not a complaint, but a concern. If you do know her, let me know, would you please?
Anything further?
That's it.
All right, thank you. Utilities, Mr. Gall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Utilities Committee met tonight and had a full discussion on the proposed ordinance, which I understand is 24.
That will be number 24.
The committee reviewed that ordinance under the guidance of Mr. Weingart, spent considerable amount of time reviewing it. The committee did move it out of committee with a 3-0 vote, and will be submitting it to council.
All right, and that's dealing with what he was talking about.
That is the
sanitary.
sanitary sewer for the new Garden Avenue to South Lincoln Avenue.
All right, thank you. Traffic and safety, Mr. Whitehill.
Thank you, Mr. President. My committee has not met. I have no report. However, I have scheduled a meeting for Monday, May 16th at 6 p.m. in council chambers. The topic of the meeting will be the maximum hiring age for firefighters.
And you have an ordinance for this
And I do,
evening?
sorry, I do
That's
also
all
have
right.
an ordinance for tonight as well.
That'll be number 25, that dealing with authorizing the mayor to enter into an agreement with the Ohio Department of Transportation for the purpose of replacing poles and other various items.
One more comment, if I may.
Yes,
As it relates to that meeting that we scheduled, I did confirm with the law director that we do not have to have rules and ordinance attend that meeting. We can recommend that change directly from our committee.
Great.
very good, thank you. Rules and ordinances, Mrs. Dickey.
Okay. Rules and Ordinance Committee met April 19th at 6 p.m. in council chambers. All members were present. The agenda included change in the maximum age for hiring firefighters, request to increase the size of accessory buildings to 1,500 square feet, design review board ordinance changes, and residency requirements. The committee was presented with a request from Chief Scott Mason to decrease the maximum hire age for firefighters from 40 years old to 33 years old. The request came due to a change in the number of years a firefighter in the state of Ohio must work to qualify for retirement. The number of years increased to 28 years. I met with Chief Mason to hear his concerns. These concerns included physical ability to complete the tasks required of firefighters as the force ages, 4 firemen on call dependent on each other to provide rescue for victims and each other, and physical deterioration or decreased ability would increase the danger for all the rescue scenarios. The city cannot force a fireman to retire, and firemen are more likely to want to remain on duty beyond their physical ability in order to qualify for retirement. Chief Mason was present and answered questions by the committee in regard to his concerns and the changes recently. He also stated that he consulted the law director, members of the force, and the union about these proposed changes, and they had no objections. Attorney Gall questioned changing the standards based on the state benefits change. He also asked that we get more information from Attorney Zellers on the legal position involved in the change. Mr. Brown stated that he was in favor of reducing the age of hire. I stated that I understand the physical concerns of the chief, but dislike excluding people from obtaining a job based on age alone. I also stated that the chief was the expert on the effects of age on firefighters, so I would take his opinion for the need for younger firefighters. Attorney Gall made a motion to table the discussion until the committee could get more information from the law director and some benchmarking with other departments. He also asked for the maximum hire age for the police department. I asked Chief Mason how long the committee had to discuss this without causing any hiring issues for the department. Chief Mason stated that they have no one on the hire list at this time, and the Civil Service Commission would be compiling a new list in about a month. He would like to have the new ordinance in place before the list is completed. Mr. Brown seconded the motion. The committee voted 3-0 to table the discussion for 2 weeks and meet again this evening at 6:30 p.m. to finalize the discussion. That was subsequently changed because we sent it to safety, which seemed to be the appropriate committee. The next discussion was regarding a request by 2 residents to allow larger accessory buildings to be constructed on residential property. I've been approached by the zoning officer with these requests a few months back. Both requests were from residents who live on lots with vacant lots adjoining their improved lot. The suggestion was made to allow larger accessory buildings on properties with adjoining vacant lots up to 1,500 square feet because it was no different than building a house on the vacant property. The committee discussed the suggestion. At present, an accessory building can be up to 1,000 square feet depending on the size of the lot. Zach Cowan, the zoning officer, was present. Mr. Brown questioned why we would consider changing the ordinance based on 2 people's request. Mr. Cowan stated that he actually had many requests for this change. Mr. Brown stated that he was opposed to the change. I argued that many homes in Salem were built in the 50s or earlier, and the people lived differently than they did in the 50s with more cars, motorhomes, boats, etc. If we don't allow them to build garages to store them, they'll park them in the yards or buy outside the city. Attorney Gall questioned the language of the draft. He suggested changes to allow the increased square footage of the buildings if the lot was larger, and suggested the lots could be replotted to be one larger lot. I argued that that would add a lot of expense to the project, and one of the involved property owners was present and confirmed that that would be expensive. He had gotten an estimate. Mr. Brown asked the property owner what he would use the larger building to store, and the gentleman stated collectible cars. Mr. Brown then asked where he stores them now, and he stated that he's renting space outside the city. Attorney Gall then made a motion to amend the draft to state that the expansion would be allowed up to 1,500 square feet on any lot, depending on the size of the lot, and send it to council for consideration. I added that the chart with the allowable sizes per property size be included, and Attorney Gall agreed. I seconded the motion. The motion carried 2-1 with Mr. Brown voting no. The discussion was tabled for Design Review Board ordinances because we are awaiting a draft. The residency requirement for city employees was open for discussion. I stated that in reviewing the ordinances in general, I found the residency requirement is not being followed, and asked the committee if they wanted to amend it or delete it. I suggested that allowing safety forces to be considered due to on-call situations for the ordinance. The ordinance now states that city employees must live in the city or within 7 miles of the city. Attorney Gall questioned whether state laws affect this ordinance. Mrs. Brothers stated that the hiring process for the city does not follow this law, and she believed more recent state laws disallowed this ordinance. I made a motion to table this ordinance until the next meeting and allow the committee to become prepared to discuss it completely. The meeting was adjourned at 6:50 p.m.
Thank you, and then you have,
And we will
2
be
ordinances.
making a new one.
all
A new
right,
meeting.
one is number 26, that's dealing with parking meters.
Mhm.
And then that you just gave the report on, that will be number 27.
Okay.
Parks, Mr. Paparotis.
Thank you, Mr. President. My committee did not meet.
Okay. Economic Development, Mr. Nestic.
The committee has not met, but there is a meeting scheduled for the 11th. That meeting is at, verify the time, 6 o'clock on the 11th. And the topics will be, we're going to hear a report from Town Center Associates, review the Town Center Associates work. and a citywide CRA, which is a citywide abatement of improvements to property. The purpose of that, that we're moving that along, is to encourage the upgrade of properties without people being penalized by increased property taxes, and to encourage development also. So those are the two topics for the 11th on economic development.
All right. Committee of the Whole, Mr. Nestic.
The Committee of the Whole has not met, but there are two meetings that are coming up. On Monday, the 9th, we're going to be in a Committee of the Whole meeting where we're welcoming the city manager from Mentor, Ohio, who is also bringing, I believe, his president of council and his assistant city manager. And the topic of discussion is to kick off the discussion on charter government and what charter government's about, and the process that you have to go through to put a charter government together. Ken Filipiak is the city manager at Mentor, and he is with the Ohio City County Managers Association, and that's part of his work with that association is to help educate communities that are considering charter governments on the topic, and he'll have additional information for us. I will try to get to everybody some links to some information they can review in advance of that meeting, and I'd ask if you have specific questions you want to make sure that he addresses, if you can get those to me, and I'll filter those to him to make sure that that's part of his discussion and presentation.
And what time is that meeting?
That meeting is at 5:30 on the 9th. On the 24th at 6:30, I queried people, and Mr. Cushman, I didn't get a response from you. There is an email issue that I didn't get, that I'm probably getting blocked on. But anyhow, everybody else responded that the 24th at 6:30 is a good time on their schedules for a Committee of the Whole meeting to discuss curbside recycling. So that is the 24th at 6:30. The topic is curbside recycling. A couple more things. The meeting on the 9th regarding charter government, this is a big community kind of thing, so I'd ask if we can get that televised so that, you know, it could play on YouTube and the cable channel and stuff also, so that people can see it. The other thing I want to make sure that I mention about the Committee of the Whole, in the past few months, 6 months or so, people have come forward and said, you know, approached me and said, call a Committee of the Whole meeting. I'd like to have a Committee of the Whole meeting on something, and I just want to remind people that it's Brett that calls a Committee of the Whole meeting. Either the President of Council calls a Committee of the Whole meeting, or two chairs of standing or special committees that call a Committee of the Whole meeting, or two council members with a vote of rest of council. So you'll notice I push it to Brett whenever anybody asks me, and let him decide. So I just want to remind people of that process for getting those meetings going.
Very good, thank you.
Thanks.
That concludes the report of standing committees. There are no second and third readings of ordinances and resolutions this evening. Therefore, we'll move on to the introduction of ordinances and resolutions. Mr. Gall.
Mr. President, I would move that ordinance 24, I'd move that we suspend council rules so that ordinance 24 can have its 3 readings with an emergency clause this evening.
Is there a second on that? Mrs. Dickey? Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Gall?
Yes.
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
Mr. Pepperidis?
Yes.
Mr. Whitehill?
Yes.
All right, council rules are suspended. Mr. Gall.
Thank you, sir. I move that we suspend the statutory rules so that ordinance 24 can have all 3 readings by title only with an emergency clause, sir.
Is there a second on that? Mr. Nestic. Madam Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Gall?
Yes.
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
Mr. Pepperidis?
Yes.
Mr. Whitehill?
Yes.
All right, statutory rules are suspended. Mr. Gall.
I move for the adoption of said ordinance read by title only, sir.
All Right, Madam Clerk, would you please read ordinance number 24 by title only for its first, second, and third readings this evening with emergency clause?
Being an ordinance authorizing the Salem Utilities Superintendent to design, advertise for bid, and enter into contracts as required to construct a sanitary sewer system generally known as the Snyder Road Sanitary Trunk Sewer and declaring an emergency.
All right, is there any discussion? Seeing none, Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll on ordinance number 24 for passage this evening?
Mr. Gall?
Yes.
Mr. Whitehill?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
All right, that passes with 7 yeas. Mr. Whitehill.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to suspend council rules so that ordinance 25 can be considered this evening.
All right, is there a second on that? Mrs. Dickey? Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Gall?
Yes.
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Whitehill?
Yes.
Council rules are suspended. Mr. Whitehill.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to suspend statutory rules so that ordinance 25 may be given all three readings tonight.
Is there a second on that? Mr. Cushman? Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Whitehill?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
Mr. Gall?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
All right, statutory rules are suspended. Mr. Whitehill.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the clerk read ordinance 25 by title only for its first, second, and third reading tonight for passage, including the emergency clause.
All right, Madam Clerk, would you please read ordinance number 25 by title only for its first, second, and third readings this evening with the emergency clause?
Being an ordinance authorizing the mayor to enter into an agreement with the Ohio Department of Transportation for the purpose of replacing poles, mast arms, and wiring above the foundations within the streetscape area in the city of Salem, Columbiana County, Ohio, and declaring an emergency.
All right, is there any discussion? Mrs. Dickey.
I just want to ask, but this is something that is going to be paid for in part by the state of Ohio, correct? And,
Large part.
okay, and it said that there was a limit on how much that was. How much out of pocket for the city of Salem is there in doing this project?
I believe the only cost there is to the city is those costs for the area outside the streetscape.
Which would be how much?
Second and North Ellsworth, is that right, Ken?
Correct.
And is there one other area?
Maybe one other one, but I think that's the only one.
What was our estimate for cost for the community?
Less than $10,000.
Yeah, it wasn't very much. I would say between 10 and 15,000,
Okay, thank you.
yeah. And when they have the bids, when the bids come in, we'll know exactly.
Okay.
But this is just to get it to,
I know those were very expensive in the past when we talked about replacement, so I just wondered what we were talking about in the ballpark.
yeah, no, it's very, very small amount of money from the city.
Any further discussion? Seeing none, Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll on ordinance number 25 for passage this evening?
Mr. Whitehill?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
Mr. Gall?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Passes with 7 yeas. Mrs. Dickey.
I would like to ask that ordinance 26 be given its first reading this evening.
All right, Madam Clerk, would you please read ordinance number 26 for its first reading this evening?
Being an ordinance repealing and removing Chapter 353 of Part 3 of the codified ordinances of the city of Salem regarding parking meters.
All right, Mrs. Dickey.
I'd like to ask that ordinance 27 be given its first reading this evening.
Madam Clerk, would you please read ordinance number 27 for its first reading this evening?
Being an ordinance amending Section 1193.01 of Chapter 1193 of the codified ordinances of the city of Salem.
All right, that concludes the introduction of ordinances and resolutions. We'll move on to the pleasure of council. Mr. Cushman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have nothing this evening.
Mr. Brown.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'd like to remind everybody that Thursday is National Day of Prayer. 10th year that Salem has been involved and participated. There'll be prayer ceremonies at the Village Green at 12 o'clock noon on Thursday. Be very nice if some of us would show up. Thank you.
Mr. Gall.
I'd just like to say congratulations to a phenomenal weekend. If you had the opportunity to go to the Beauty and the Beast, those 5 performances were absolutely outstanding. And there's still one more weekend available for the Church Basement Ladies, and that is a really cute play at the Salem Community Theater. Thank you.
Mrs. Dickey.
I would like to say that I went around my neighborhood again and took a look because of the nice weather, and I want to remind people that it is an ordinance in the city of Salem that you have to cut your grass and that you have to have a sanitary yard. Also, the parking ordinance in the front yard is in force, and you need to think about that, especially in this wet time. Tearing up those yards is really unsightly. I also want to congratulate and commend the people who've been out in their yards, getting them all ready for spring, making them look beautiful. And I also want to say that I think we should use some contingency funds for a spring cleanup, perhaps for the people who are really trying to keep their properties nice, and also to get rid of these bags that are sitting on almost every block from people who are really working hard in their yards. I know that Mr. Nestick feels that that should only be used for permanent changes for economic development, but you have to start at the very basic. If your yards and your neighborhoods look shabby, you are not going to attract businesses.
Mr. Nestick.
Nothing, thank you.
Mr. Whitehill.
To expand upon Mr. Gall's support of the theater, I happen to know someone helping behind the scenes, and also some of the crew members and cast members, and it is a wonderful show. I look forward to seeing it this weekend. They are also preparing The Little Mermaid Junior, which I happen to know someone in the cast for that one as well, which will be coming up soon. And as always, we do ask to support the local theater. Also, real quickly, I'm going to say congratulations to my daughter Paige, who played in her first 10-year-old softball game tonight, first softball game, and she was on third, ready to come home, and I had to leave and come here, so that was a little tough. In relation to the cleanup, to both the city cleanup as well as the leaf bags, I admit that I'm a little confounded at the moment, because I agree with the city maybe perhaps helping. However, we can't kid ourselves and say just one more cleanup and this will go away, because this will be the exact same situation next spring. The seasons change. There'll be bags out there again, and it was to provide, the contingency was to do permanent improvements either in our wards or for the city in general. So I can't say that I've decided one way or the other whether I would or wouldn't support it, but I just wanted to add that in there. And I do disagree, and I'm sorry Ms. Popa is not here tonight, but a lot of this comes down to personal responsibility. It is your job to get rid of your yard refuse. It was not guaranteed in any form to be done by the government for you, along with your trash and your old furniture and everything else. So I struggle as a conservative saying that we should, do that for them and all our problems will go away. Some people just live in filth because they do. It is the reality that we see every day as we drive around the city. I don't know that a cleanup gets rid of that, but it also can't hurt. So I think we should continue to discuss and possibly consider and see what happens. Thank you.
Mr. Paparotis.
Thank you, Mr. President. No comments from me tonight.
I have nothing either this evening. I just would echo Mr. Brown made good comments with the day of prayer. People should turn out for that. I know I will be there in the mayor's stead, as he's not able to be. So I would encourage everybody to do that. That is all, for the meeting's adjourned.